I am here to provide you information about HIPAA. This is part of a series of courses or series of chapters that are and represent the HIPAA basics as well as HIPAA advanced information, specifically talking about the administrative simplification provisions of the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. The unit that is discussed in this particular section is entitled HIPAA Basics. The unit objectives for this section, to understand the purpose behind the HIPAA legislation, why was it passed in the first place, and this will provide a broad scope or broad understanding of the Act itself, not just what we'll be concentrating on during the course of the different chapters or units that will be covered in this whole section of training. Second, we'll be reviewing the HIPAA Administrative Simplification title, which is specifically what this training addresses, and looking at what are the components of the Administrative Simplification title, as well as who will be involved or impacted by the Administrative Simplification title. I'll also be reviewing non-compliance penalties, both civil and criminal. This material has been updated to include the information about the increased penalties, the civil penalties that have been increased, as well as the two additional criminal penalty categories or criminal categories that were addressed in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, otherwise known as ARRA, and the specific section of the Act, which is Title 13, otherwise known as the HITECH Act, which added additional privacy and security provisions that will impact both covered entities and business associates. Next slide. Also, we will be talking about and reviewing key organizations that are associated with the administration of the HIPAA Administrative Simplification provisions. These are organizations that existed before HIPAA passed, as well as organizations that are addressed statutorily as having a role in implementing the administrative simplification provisions. Finally, we will be reviewing HIPAA-related terminology and definitions. These are definitions, terminology that will be used not only in this particular unit, but also in subsequent units. So it's to provide you a foundation of information so that it makes it easier to understand and follow as we move through information about the administrative simplification provisions, what they are, and how to implement them and comply with the HIPAA requirements. Next slide. The first topic that we will be discussing today in this particular exercise or unit is the HIPAA introduction. Next slide. As far as an overview, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996, otherwise known as HIPAA, addressed insurance portability, fraud, and administrative simplification. Administrative simplification was only a small component of the total act and was inserted or included in the Act at the request of the healthcare industry. The healthcare industry at the time was seeking assistance from Congress in establishing national standards for the exchange of health administrative-related transactions electronically. This was watershed legislation for the healthcare industry. It included some significant provisions and changes on how the healthcare industry will act or needs to act from the point the act was passed and on into the future. It resulted in substantial investments in e-health initiatives and the deployment of security technology in the healthcare industry. This can also be seen today through the passage of ARRA and the HITECH Act, which includes additional information, additional funding for continued expansion of e-health initiatives. Now, the administrative simplification provisions themselves primarily addressed healthcare administrative activity. The intent was not to address what amounts to clinical electronic health information exchange or HIT, health information technology, in the clinical space. But the new act that passed this year, the HITECH Act, is a continuation of a move into the clinical side of information exchange in an attempt to standardize those. We will not specifically be addressing in this particular unit the new changes that were made other than how it impacts some of the things like criminal and civil penalties. But one of the things to keep in mind is that there were some significant changes, and that the move in the way of e-health initiatives, or HIT, is continuing today, and there is funding available for such continuation, as well as the development of additional standards around the clinical side of e-health. Next slide. The HIPAA Act of 1996 became law on August 21st of 1996. HIPAA is also known as Public Law 104 through 191, which was where it was or became a part of statute. Initially, it was known as H.R. 3103. It's also known as the Kennedy-Kassenbaum Bill. HIPAA was the brainchild of Senator Ted Kennedy and Senator Nancy Kassenbaum, and it became HIPAA, or the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and was a bipartisan effort between Senator Kennedy and Senator Kassenbaum as the bill moved through Congress and finally became law. Next slide. Now, the goals of HIPAA is the U.S. Congress passed HIPAA to do a number of different things. One of them was to improve the portability and continuity of health insurance coverage in the group market. As an example, if an employee, or say you, were moving from one employer to another, and you were covered under a group plan under your first employer, and then another group plan, the second employer, before HIPAA, the new health plan could impose a pre-existing condition clause. HIPAA was passed to prohibit that, so that if an employee is moving from one group health plan to another, either within the same employer or between employers, then the new health plan cannot any longer impose pre-existing condition clauses just because one employee moved from one group health plan to another. Another purpose was to combat fraud, waste, and abuse in healthcare, or health insurance, and healthcare delivery. This is an area where there is a significant amount of expense related to healthcare, and the idea was to prevent, where possible, fraud and abuse in the areas of Medicare, Medicaid, and other areas and other activities in the health information industry that resulted in and continues to result in increased costs to purchasers of health insurance and also purchasers of health care. It promoted the use of medical savings accounts, also known as HSAs, or health savings accounts. And the purpose behind the health savings accounts was to allow individuals to set aside money that can be used to pay for health care expenses, such as if an employee is enrolled in a high deductible health insurance plan, that money could be used to pay for the health care that would not be covered because of the high deductible. And that money that is set aside is tax-free. Another reason that HIPAA was passed was to improve access to long-term care services and coverage. It was to open up that care and service so that more individuals could take advantage when they needed to, either as a result of a disability or services to the elderly. Finally, the purpose was to simplify healthcare administrative data exchange, and that is the key purpose behind this series, is to talk about the healthcare administrative data exchange and the simplifications that were anticipated as part of this act. Now, next slide. The titles that were included, and as with all legislation, there are generally a number of titles, just as I've already talked about ARA, or the HITECH Act, which was Title 13 of what many people call the stimulus package. The same is true with HIPAA. There were several titles that included different areas that were a part of the legislation soon to become statute. Title I addressed healthcare insurance access, portability, and renewability. In other words, the ability to move from one group health plan to another without the imposition of a pre-existing condition clause. Another reason in Title II was the prevention of healthcare fraud and abuse, and also the administrative simplification, as well as medical liability reform. So Title II is the section of the HIPAA statute that will be concentrated on in this series of workshops or presentations that deal with the HIPAA administrative simplification provisions. This is also where the language around preventing fraud and abuse was found, and also medical liability reform was included to